Hi everyone, this is Sabha. Welcome back to Security Architect Playbook series. If this is your first video, this series is all about breaking down real enterprise architectures and showing how security architects actually assess them. Not diagrams with some magical arrows, not vendor slides, but real environments. In previous episodes, we covered zero trust architecture, CI/CD, software supply chain, and multiple other things, right? So if you haven't watched those, I'll recommend doing that. Now, let's be honest about something. Most organizations believe they are securing their environment well. Strong identity, your good network controls, cloud security in place. But the actual target in most of the attacks is not just the system, right? It's the data. And in many cases, we don't really know where all our sensitive data is, who actually have access to that, or how is it moving across different systems. So this session is about understanding data security from a architectural perspective, not just a control on paper stuff. So what are we going to do here is break this down step by step. What we'll look at is where data lives, how it's classified, who can access it, how it's protected, how it moves, and how we actually monitor all of this. And most importantly, how a security architect evaluates whether any of this is actually working. So, in a typical organization, data is everywhere. I believe you'll all agree. It can be in your databases, cloud storage, SaaS platforms, user devices, and not just one copy, usually multiple copies, right? Your backups, exports, in some reports. For example, customer data exists in your production database, then in analytical systems, then in your exported Excel files, then in someone's laptop as well, right? So when someone asks where is our sensitive data, the honest answer is rarely clean, and that's the first problem. So let's map like where data actually lives. Structured data in your databases, right? So unstructured data in your file system, and some massive data sets in your data lakes. Business data will also be inside your SaaS platforms, and then your endpoints, right? So which is often ignored. For instance, a developer downloads production data to debug an issue, for example, right? So that data now exists outside your controlled environment, and unless you're tracking that, you have already lost the visibility. So now comes your classification. In theory, this is simple. Label data as either public or internal, confidential, restricted, and then many more, right? But in reality, most organizations either don't classify their data properly or classify once and forget it forever, right? So if you take an example, a document marked as internal 2 years ago now might consist of some sensitive financial projections, right? But the label never got changed. So policies tied to classification don't apply correctly, right? So classification only works if it's accurate, consistent, and continuously verified and updated. Now, okay, let's talk about access part of it. Who can access the data? And more importantly, who should not? That's important, right? So access should be identity driven, role based, and minimal as possible. But what usually happens? Access grows over time, right? So people change their roles, project evolves, and the permission just stays. Again, if you want me to take an example, an engineer who needed some temporary access to production data still has it 1 year later, right? So that's what I'm talking about. Not because it's required, but because nobody reviewed it and removed it. That's how excessive access just builds silently. Now, the protection side of it. As we all know, encryption is the baseline. But again, let's be very honest. Encryption alone doesn't solve access misuses, right? So, if an authorized user accesses data and misuses it, encryption doesn't stop that, it cannot. So, we layer additional controls on top of it. To start with, tokenization for any sensitive fields if that exists in your data, masking for non-production environments, your strong key management. I'll be having a different session just to talk about key management for your information. So again, if you want to take an example here, instead of exposing full credit card numbers, you tokenize them, right? So even if data leaks, it's not usable. So protection is not just about securing your storage, it's about reducing impact even when your data is breached. Now, yeah, your data movement and the exposure. This is where things usually break. Data does not stay in one place, as we already discussed. It keep moving, right? So because when you wanted to use a data, it moves from one system to other system for some business use cases. It can be through your API or through your pipelines, exports, some integrations. It can be anything. So imagine if data flows from production to analytics to a reporting tool and finally to an external sharing platform. At each step, your control may weaken, right? So, and often nobody tracks the full journey of the data. So, when a data leaks, the question becomes, where did it actually went wrong? And the answer is somewhere in the moment, because we don't know. We don't know where exactly things broken. That's why now the big one, visibility, right? So if you cannot see how data is being accessed or how data is being moved, you are operating just on assumptions. So we monitor access patterns, some unusual downloads, data transfers, even your behavior anomalies. So imagine if a user suddenly starts downloading large volume of sensitive data at an odd hours, middle of the night, 1 o'clock or something, for instance. That's not a normal behavior, right? But without monitoring, it looks like just another request. So detection is what turns activity into an insight. So we need to monitor those. And on the governance side, so data doesn't live forever, or at least it shouldn't, right? So we need proper retention policies, data minimization, your secure deletion. So this becomes very important when it comes to your governance and having the proper life cycle around that. So if a old customer data sitting in storage for many years, just in case, right? So that's not useful. That becomes a liability for your organization. The more unnecessary data you keep, the more you have to protect. So you have to spend. So governance is about actually reducing that particular burden. So how do we assess all this? That's the important part, right? So we don't start with tools. Say for example, if I tell you tool A can do this, tool B will do this, and tool C is supposed to do this, no, we're not focusing there. So we start with questions. As a security architect, where is the sensitive data? How is it classified? Who has access? Who is not supposed to have access? How does the data actually move? Can we see it very clearly? Are we monitoring it? These are the things as a security architect you have to ask during your assessment. Then we map everything together, because individually controls may look very good, right? But architecture actually reveals the gap between them when you assess it from this perspective. So at a high level, what we validate is, do we know where our data is? Is classification consistent? Is access controlled properly? And are protection mechanisms applied? Then, is data movement completely visible? Is monitoring centralized? If any of this looks weak, that's actually your risk zone, right? So as an architect, we need to focus on all this. Now, some common gaps. So this is what we usually find in different organizations. Unknown data locations, as we already discussed, people doesn't know where exactly the data is being stored. Where do they have sensitive data, right? And then inconsistent classifications, sometimes excessive access permissions. It can be like one type of access which is growing from many years, and that's a privilege creep what he have, right? So and then duplicate data everywhere. Data is getting duplicated for some reason, then not being deleted, so it exists in multiple locations which you're not tracking. Then no visibility in movement, as we discussed in one of the example. If your data is moving from one system to other system for some business use cases, it must be visible, it must be monitored, right? Then your weak detection capabilities. For instance, if there is a incident which is happening but people think it's a regular request, right? So means there is no good detection capabilities. And the pattern is always same. Control exists but they don't connect, right? So that's the problem. At the end of the day, system don't matter as much as the data inside them. So attackers don't break in just to access your servers or access your databases, right? So they break in to extract the value out of it, and that value is always your data. So the real question is not are our systems secure? It's actually, do we understand our data and do we control our data? Because if the answer is no, everything else is just surface level security. Thanks for listening and see you in the next video.